We'll kick this thing off. My name is Steve Upton, president of CHROMiX here, and a co-developer with Don Hutcheson of the Curve software. Curve started out as Ideal Ink Curve when we marketed it exclusively through ID Alliance, but it was the same team working on it, Don and I and other CHROMiX folks as well. We then broke it off from ID Alliance as far as marketing goes and marketed it on its own as Curve3. At that point, ID Alliance rolled out their G7 certification for tools, and Curve3 was basically the first tool that was certified for the purpose, along with, I believe, 2 other tools right at the very outset. We've now updated with Curve3, and we welcome you to attending this webinar. We're pretty proud of what we've done here. We've been working on it for quite a while. There's kind of a plethora of different features. We're doing our best to put in features that address specific needs and or problems that users encountered. Some specific features that are actually good for the broader user community, if you will. So some of this stuff you'll go, why would I want that? And trust me, others will. Whereas others of these features, pretty much everybody's going to benefit from. The first one that comes to mind for that is smoothing. Don Hutcheson is with us today, and he is the originator of the G7 method, as well as the bull that went into the China shop that was ID Alliance and shook stuff about G7 gray balance in and all sorts of stuff. It's his desktop we're looking at right now, and I'm going to toss, or hand at least, the audio baton over. I'll be interjecting and heckling along the way. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Don Hutcheson.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks everybody for attending. Know how busy everybody is, so we don't want to make this any longer than necessary. We anticipate we won't be any longer than an hour today. If we can do it in less, that would be good. We want to make sure, though, you all get to see all the nice new features of this new version of Curve. What you're seeing at the moment on the screen is the splash screen. Probably the most attractive but least valuable new feature of Curve3 is the splash screen is now in color. At great expense, we've paid for the extra colors for every pixel, so that wave is now in color. If you remember Curve2, it was in black and white. So if you can't read numbers and you don't recognize a 3 or a 2, you'll know you're running Curve3 because the wave is in color. All right, enough of that. So here is the primary interface, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through the primary interface views, and then we'll look at the main functions. And when I've done my bit, I'll be showing us example files and so on, and also their effects where necessary in Photoshop. And then when I'm done, Steve will take over and fill in anything that I might have forgotten. So if you look at the main UI, and if you already have Curve2, so for most of you it'll be what's different. Well, we've arranged things a little bit differently on the left. If you remember Curve2, down the left here, we had 5 buttons that would basically set up, ink test, calibration curve or runs, verify, and virtual press run. We've moved those along the top here, and they're now little icons that look a little bit like a smartphone icon. Does basically the same thing. So in that first icon, that is the setup icon, the main change here is that we've added an extra functionality. Curve2 would do G7 calibration, and it would also do TVI calibration. Part of Curve3's new features is that by request from a number of people, we now actually allow you to calibrate special inks. This basically allows you to calibrate any inks at all that aren't in the CMYK world. At the moment, you could only do 4 at a time, but we'll show you how that works, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So let's go back to the G7 button. The rest of this window, by the way, nothing much has changed. Opportunity to put in your name and device, etc., and some notes. And then when you save a session, that information is saved. Also, when you go to print out a report, this information is saved on the report. A lot of people find that very useful at the end of a G7 session. They will actually print out a report and file that, and it allows them to do retro-analysis of what was going on. Okay, going to the next button. The next button is the ink test button. Nothing much has changed here. You can load a variety of different data sets. It could be a P2P target. It could be an IT8 target. It could be just a very small set of measurements from, for example, just 6 or 7 ink things if you want. Now, this happens to be a really awful data set, as you can see, but it's still enough to load, and we can now see the delta E from whatever our target is that we're looking for. Let's say Grackle here. you can see already that we're probably not going to hit the Grackle points here, but if we come down to swap coded, although this data looks terrible, in fact, it looks like it was out on the town last night and I had one too many drinks, it's clear that the solid ink colors are pretty darn close to coded 3, which is the primary purpose of this window. We can see that delta E's aren't terribly far away from swap 3. Obviously, if I loaded some other data, it would probably look better. In fact, why don't we try to do that? I really hate that data. It looks ugly. Look at, I think I've got something in here. Yes, I've got
Don, if you could widen that window, just widen the window just a smidge,
okay,
then I think it'll be good. Sorry for the interruption.
That's all right. I'll widen the window. Yeah, that's what you're there for, to interrupt.
Right.
Okay, so what we're looking at here is this happens to be a P2P target that has excellent LAB values in it. So if I go back to Grackle, this would be just a way that you'd quickly find out, is this ink set going to work? Now, the big difference you see is on the right-hand side, we have the good old trusted spider graph that it's become known as, which is a plan view of the 6 ink ramps without telling you anything about L-star. So if you hit the center of those dots, in the past on Curve2, you really didn't know whether you're good in the L-star domain or not. So now each one of these ramps is also graphed over here in these 6 little mini graphs, which go chroma 0 on the left to maximum on the right, and lightness 0 at the bottom, maximum on the top, 100 on the top. And the beauty of having that whole graph is you can see now whether you've hit that dot and also what's happening to the rest of the ramp. So this is almost like a 3D view. This was probably a 2 6/2D view, if we can invent that concept. Now, we're also giving you the LAB numbers instead of just the delta E's that was asked for. And the CMYK values, if we import spectral data, will be converted into density. We notice here that the paper density isn't there, but I've got Steve online, and he's going to immediately agree that the next dot release will show the paper density too, won't it, Steve?
Yes, absolutely.
Good. That's how you get upgrades. So that's enough, I think, for ink test. That's really just a very, very quick test to see are my inks any good. Now, if we click on the next window, this is really the meat and potatoes. This is where all the value of Curve3 happens. This is the Calibrate window. It looks very similar to Curve2. Under the hood, there's a number of nice little enhancements and features that make this a lot more valuable as a piece of software. On the left, we still have the same list of runs. We can make a new run by hitting the plus button. We can rename that run by saying Don's run or whatever we want to. And sometimes when you're doing a lot of runs, renaming them is a smart idea. We can get rid of it that way. If I go back to run 1 here, I'm just going to load some data real quickly. My webinar stuff, I'm just going to load a lab data set. This is from a P2P target. So far, everything's the way you're used to seeing it, but immediately you'll see that this happens to be a pretty awful data set. So it's a great opportunity to demonstrate probably the most exciting new feature in Curve3, and that is the smooth button down here. Now, those of you who are into math or science will know there's a number of different ways of smoothing data. If you want to smooth a line, for example, you can do a Bezier analysis of it and smooth the line. We looked at many different algorithms, and we came up with one which we don't believe anyone has ever used before, which actually does a 4-dimensional modeling of the press. So this is not simple smoothing of the output data. We are actually smoothing the input data. If I click smooth, you'll see something pretty dramatic happening over here on the black curve. There was some data in there that just didn't make any sense. This is probably a measuring problem or a printing problem that doesn't seem to fit with the way this printing press really should have worked. This actually happens to be flexo data. And if you look at these TVI curves, they're pretty jiggly. It's like a mountain range seen in 3D. There's no way in God's creation that's really how that press was performing. That's probably because we're just looking at a single sample. If I click on smooth, not only that spurious data in the black is completely removed, but the TVI curves now are very much better behaved. The gray balance curves here, the A star and B star, still retain a large part of the noise that was in them, but some of the smaller stuff in the highlight here is gone. This is all a byproduct of the way this algorithm works, and to really explain it would require a couple of hours, and I don't want to get into that right now. Bottom line is this is enormously valuable, especially when you only have a limited number of samples to work from. Look at how bad this data is. You just cannot get a good calibration on this. Proof of that would be if I go to Create Curves. look at these curves. These are disastrous. These curves are actually going through a reversal, which would be completely the wrong thing to do in your RIP. But if I click on the smooth button, those reversals are removed, and we now have a set of curves which still aren't particularly exciting, but are much more likely or unlikely to be dangerous if I put those in a RIP. Even now here we're getting a little bit of a noise here. Let's go back to the 10% points. I think I liked it better like that. This is a tool that is going to be very valuable for people who are forced to work either with very noisy data or with only a limited amount of data. Now if I add in some more data here, here are some additional data sets. From that same press run, here's a few more data sets. And as we add them in, Curve is still doing its averaging as well. So the averaging function in Curve, that's very, very important. But having averaged it, if you click on the smooth button, you're going to get even better results. So I find myself using the smooth button now, even on an offset press, and it's just giving me better data. It doesn't smooth the output device. It smooths the data that you're putting into Curve and turns it into what it would have been if you'd had the ability to go to that output device and do whatever was necessary to reduce the noise in the printing or the noise in the measuring. So think of this as an augmentation to averaging. That's probably a good way of looking at it. So you'll see that the function of the smoothing is displayed in any of these windows. We're smoothing the input data. So if we look at the hue chroma diagram and I switch off smoothing, again, we've got these drunken curves that are swaying left to right. When we click on smooth, they're improved quite a lot. They're not completely smoothed. They're smoothed in a safe way, but not in an aggressive way, in a way that would be ridiculous. So that's one of the really cool new features in Curve 3. Now, one of the things that people have asked for numerous times in the last 3 or 4 years is, could we please save these control points down here? So if I, for example, decided that my device always needed a 2% and a 5%, but I didn't need the 90, and I like that set of curve points. In the past, it was impossible to save it. Now we can actually save a control point set, and I can call it Don's set if I like. I can put it anywhere I like, actually, as long as I can come back to that. Now it's going to appear in the load menu. If I want to load it, there's Don's set. I can load those curves again. It seems like a small thing, but this is something that a lot of people have asked for.
There is also a folder, I believe it's in the documentation. If you make a folder called Control Point Files in the same folder as the app, you can load them in there, and then when you launch Curve, they will appear at the bottom of that pop-up.
I wrote the user guide. I remember writing that. Why didn't I know that for the webinar?
Yeah, that's all right. So
in here, you can actually save it in a custom folder. Yeah, good point, Steve.
Yeah. So
I'll have to remember that one next time. But that's nothing compared to this feature over here. Here's the thing that is really going to save you a lot of money. I have several times been to places where after a whole morning in the press room, getting the first press run, we go to build the curves, and then we discover that contrary to the information I'd been given, it turns out there were actually curves in the RIP after all. Now, as you probably know if you've had the formal training, it is a very unwise idea to run the P2P target in anything but a linear state. But if you find that the press actually had curves in the plate making RIP, then the calculations here may be inaccurate. When you put these in the RIP, or when you put delta values into the RIP, it may not give you what you expected. So we strongly advise you to always run with a linear press run. Now, it's a very expensive proposition at the end of a whole morning to discover, oh my gosh, we didn't have linear plates. Let's go make linear plates and do that press run again. So we've put in a very valuable new feature here. In the based on list, if you know what that curve was, you can actually type it into a text file and then load it here where it says Load Initial Curves. But where do you get that text file from? To make it as easy as possible, we made the file format exactly the same as the CGAT file format that we export. So if I export, I'm going to put this onto the webinar stuff. If I export a text file and just say text file or whatever, I'm going to put it into Curve3 webinar stuff. If I go into Microsoft Excel and I load that file, here you see a very simple text file. that has whatever control points we had present in Curve3 when we saved that. So you can see we had a 2, 5, and an 80, etc. There they are. And here are the CMYK output values. It's a very simple matter to go in there and manually enter what you read off the user interface of the current calibration curves, the linearization curves, in the plate setter. You can now save this as a text file, and if you load that in here, say load initial curves, and we go and load that very same file, now Curve3 knows that those curves were in play, so now the values that come out here are the correct replacement curves for what we're in the RIP. This is going to save my clients quite a lot of money and me a lot of hassle, because I can honestly tell you 5 or 6 times in the last 5 years I've had a situation where everyone swore and declared, oh no, the RIP is linear, the things didn't work, and then we realized, that's because there was actually a curve present in the RIP. So hopefully you're going to find that very valuable.
And some print processes actually do a bit better job with the curve in place as well.
Yes, they do. There are reasons why some people actually want to put in a preemptive curve. Stochastic is a classic example. Most people are aware that stochastic or FM screening tends to have a higher gain. Sometimes it has a very strong S-curve. If your client or you as a press control person knows that there's a good idea to put a preemptive curve in, by all means do it on the RIP, but do it somewhat smoothly. Don't get crazy, and then copy those values into the text file. You can now tell Curve that RIP curve was present. What you will get is a better calibration, and Curve will get you to the final point quicker and more precisely. So that's a very nice little feature in Curve here. Now, there's a number of other things to show you that are very, very cool in this window here, the calibration window. If you look below the graph here, click on white-black. You'll see we've added a new editorial point. In the past, you could choose to use the paper white or the custom white. If you wanted to, you could literally click on here and type in a color of paper that you think you would like to emulate. So if I type in -6 and then recalc, it's going to actually add yellow to compensate for that -6 paper. Not something I recommend people do very often, but it's a nice little feature anyway that some people do use. But over here, we have a new feature, the black point. And this data is annoying me. I'm going to make a new run. I'm going to load some data more appropriate to that. So I'm going to get it from the measured black. Here's a measured black data. Just load that in here. Here you can see some data strictly as measured from a digital press. And this is really done primarily for electrophotographic digital presses. The curve was looking really great, but you could see that we have a very strongly colored black point. And there's nothing much you can do about that on some printing processes. In the offset world, you'd be strongly advised to adjust your inks to get your black point as neutral as possible. Otherwise, the likelihood of hitting grackle or swap on the press isn't very good. But in something like a dry or a wet toner device, if you have a strongly colored shadow point and you try to neutralize it perfectly, you can end up with some pretty weird curves. So if I go into my Create Curves and I say white-black as printed, you're going to get a warning there. But if we recalculate, it's now going to calculate those curves so that we can still ask for maximum gray balance correction, but it's going to do it in a way such that when we look at our resulting curves, gray balance will be adhered all the way down to 50% according to the official curve. But then after that, it's going to start aiming for that point there instead of trying to neutralize all of the shadows. What that tends to produce is a smoother calibration and a better looking reproduction. The only downside is you will be given a warning that if I do this, a warning is going to come up saying that you may not now hit the G7 legacy target values for gray balance. We have petitioned ID Alliance to allow this as a legal way of calibration on the devices that cannot get the shadow point neutralized. In the meantime, we're already finding that we can get a smoother calibration on something like a digital press by using this, even if it means that only with the curves you would not pass G7. The point about this is it makes a better calibration upon which then to build an ICC profile, if that's what you're going to do. So use it with caution. Do not use this with offset printing. Try to get your gray balance of the shadow point as neutral as possible. But if you have a device that you can't do this, you may find that useful. I'm going to go back to the legacy position. Now, in the gray balance slider, you may have noticed there's now two controls. We always had one which was called the start point. We also now have a stop point. Some people asked us, could we switch all gray balance correction off after a certain point and only have the transition occur between the start and the stop? So we now allow you to do that. Do let us know if you find this useful. We don't think this is a huge feature, but nevertheless there are people who said, beyond a certain point, I don't want to be even trying to create gray balance because my device is too unstable. So now you have a control over where you start and where you stop. One of the really cool features, though, is this button over here called Normalized High Density. And again, this is something you wouldn't want to be using very often, and certainly not in an offset world. This is primarily for very high-density printing devices, especially where the RIP has extremely high-density ink values. So I know it, here it is, P2B Raw HK. I think that should open fine. Yes, there you go. So now if you look at the NPDC curve, you can see that on the CMY scale, we have a very, very high density going on. At about 75%, we're getting a density equivalent virtually to what we get at 100. Very plugged shadows indeed. And we also have an extremely green result going on here. To visualize that, if I go into Photoshop, we'll show you the normalized image, and I'm going to assign to that the actual profile that we're working from, 4800 raw. So if I assign that to my image, you can see how plugged and heavy the result is. Steve, is that showing up okay on your screen?
Yep. Yeah, the plugging is certainly showing up.
So here you see the raw performance of the device. Very heavy, very plugged, and an enormously green color space. Very, very green-gray balance. That's accounted for here. Now, if I go into Create Curves, the big problem is this. Look at these calibration curves. I'm asking for highlight and shadow weighted. Look what's happening to cyan, magenta, and yellow. All the way up to the second to last point, the 98% point. It's saying bring those things down to about 60 or 70%. That's fine. That's great. But the problem is the last patch, the 100% patch, goes to 100. If we didn't, we would lose saturation. So what that's going to produce is an extreme calibration that will suddenly jump very, very rapidly between 98 and 100, and that's going to produce ugly results. If I click the Normalized High Densities button, an algorithm is applied now which progressively rolls those curves off so that we cannot get any longer that horrible brick wall effect. And we're going to get a smoother calibration, which is also probably not going to pass G7. So be careful about this. It turns out that this software is being used on devices that, frankly, the G7 calibration theory may not work on very well. But we want to take advantage of as much of the G7 as we can, and then on top of that, build an ICC profile. So you'll notice that the effect is only happening in the darkest shadows. So the curve in the lighter tone here is not being affected, but we're creating just more sensible-looking curves, with the proviso that the result may not hit the tolerances G7 unless you put a profile on. But let me show you what that does. So here we have the raw data. If I now assign a profile that was built from data that was passed through those curves you just saw, first let me show you actually what the legacy calibration would have done. So here is a profile built when I didn't have normalized high densities. So these curves here were applied, and then I went and printed the IT8 target, made a profile, and here are the results we got. I don't know how many people have ever seen this result, but if you look at the ladies here on the left, I'm going to blow it up a little bit. There's a couple of things I do not like about this reproduction, and this is with G7 only, just simply showing you how it will look. The bodice here on the front of the lady has got some very harsh graininess, and this blue kimono has very harsh graininess. That's because tone values up to about 98% would drop to 63. Anything above that will push up to 100. So that's the number one problem. The number two problem is we've got this flat, lifeless appearance on the flesh tones. And yet, according to G7, we've done officially the right thing. If I go back to Curve3, I can make a new run, and in that run, I'm actually going to load the P2P data that resulted from that. So you can see the NPDC curve looks very good. The gray balance looks very good. Here's where we started from. Look at that. Very, very weird. And in just one calibration, wow, we've got a beautiful NPDC. We've got beautiful gray balance, theoretically, except at the very tail end here, we've got this extreme change in gray balance. And look at our TVI curves. That's the problem. That's what's going on that's causing this really ugly result. Now, if I go back to Curve3 and show you what happens when I click the Normalized High Densities button, actually I need to do that in here, in the raw data, Normalized High Density. Now these curves are applied to the data. In fact, we probably won't pass G7. In fact, I'm going to load the data with the normalized. This is the P2P data that was passed through that process. And you'll see that we have an error in the shadow end of the P2P. It's going too heavy on the CMYK curve, but we've got much smoother TVI curves. See that? Instead of those negative values, we've got much more normal-looking results. What does it mean, though, to the image? If we come back to Photoshop, I'll now assign an ICC profile that was done using the normalized high density, exactly the same data, but normalized. And now what you should see is a much smoother looking result. It's very saturated because we're working with extremely high density inkjet inks, but we've got an image that frankly is a better starting point from which to actually build an ICC profile. So here's where we were with the official G7 calibration. It may have done great things on the graphs, but visually it looks like garbage. If I click on what happens now with the normalize, we have a much smoother transition of these dark blues, these dark reds, and a lot more life and shape in the flesh tones. And if we look over here at the grays, the normalized looks quite nice. What we were getting before, I don't know if you can see this in the shadows of the CMY reproduction, we've got this weird posterization effect from applying too much G7 correction on a device that really didn't want it. If I click to normalize, the lighter tones look exactly the same, but we've got a much more normal-looking result in the shadows. So this is going to be huge. This is something that I've been looking for years. It's going to tremendously improve the initial calibration you get from a very high saturation inkjet device, typically a 6, 7, 8 color inkjet with very high densities. The only proviso is the initial G7 calibration, if you use the normalize button, may not pass G7, and we give you a little warning about that. When you do normalize high densities, you get this warning saying that you may not meet the G7 calibration. That's fine. We're looking for something that will produce a good starting point. So we can actually test that. If we go to the raw data, go to Analyze, go to G7, of course that was a complete fail. Let's look at the legacy setting. We were pretty close to passing everything except the extreme gray balance. But remember, it produced this ugly looking result. And if we go to the new result, the normalized one, we don't pass G7 quite as well as we were, but we've got a much better starting point on which to build an ICC profile. So just be careful about this tool. It's not to be used in offset.
A quick question about the gray boats.
Yep.
I'm wondering if those images are available for download for their use.
Yes, they're on my website, hutchcolor.com. If you click on the free button, it's under Test Targets and Images. And there's no copyright on those. You just can't sell them again. So the middle one is black only. The left one is 4 color. The one is on the right is 3 color. This is very much like the gray rails images, except they're in a format that suits this particular layout better. Yep, by all means. So just going back to Curve3 then, those are two very interesting new tools. The black aim point as printed can take you outside of the G7 world but actually produce a better calibration in some cases, specifically digital presses. Do not use that on an offset press though, please. And the normalized high density, again, it's going to take you probably outside of the ideal G7 world, but actually can make a better calibration on certain devices, especially devices with very high ink densities. So that's a pretty exciting and pretty dramatic change.
Just to mention one thing along with this that some people might not realize is part of the G7 verification process. The delta E's in your shadows are actually feathered off. Basically, the darker and darker and darker the shadow is, the color is, the less it contributes to the average delta E. So that does work in your favor. This normalized high density function affects those shadow values, and those shadow values don't contribute to the overall error as much as other parts. So it won't necessarily knock you out, but we wanted to put a caution in there to make sure people realize that it could.
Yeah, that's the weighted delta L star and the weighted delta CH values and the G7 specification. Good. Not a lot more to show you here. In the Analyze button, if we go to ink and paper, once again, we've now got these lovely side views of each one of these scales. You saw that already in the ink measurement. Now, this data happens to be spectral data, so we can actually show you the status T density going on in here, which is pretty cool. But the Calibrate window right now is being demonstrated in the normal default G7 mode. Let's go back to Setup and click on TVI. I don't know how many people on the call right now use the TVI. I see a couple people from Europe are actually listening in, I think. The TVI calibration in the past allowed you to calibrate to any of the 6 legacy standard ISO TVI curves. Now, as we speak, these curves are being replaced at the ISO level with more modern curves. So for not much longer will they be of any much value. Now, we had the decision, should we put all the new curves in and make a huge list, or should we provide a utility so that you can load any curves you like? And we thought that that was a smarter move. So rather than saying, I want my cyan to be curve B and my magenta to be curve C or whatever, we can actually say load custom. And if we go load custom, if I go to Custom TVI, I've already prepared a text file. This is actually the TVI of Grackle, or more specifically the TV, the tone value of Grackle, expressed as XYZ values. So when I load that, now for cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, we're no longer going to a standard ISO curve. We're going to the actual curve extracted, in this case, from the Grackle data. And if you want to, you could put a curve in there for the FOGRA data, FOGRA 29, FOGRA 27, FOGRA 39. Any curve data you like, any TVI data, you can actually put in there now. So now when we go to calibrate, we will actually be calibrating to hit those specific curves. Now there's one caveat. At the moment, because many people are printing and measuring only LAB data, we made the decision when we came out with Curve 2, and of course with Curve 3 as well, that we would not calculate density-based TVI. There's been a proposal afoot for quite some years now that the whole TVI algorithm should move away from density to a more agnostic XYZ or CIE-based TVI algorithm. So at the moment we are calculating these where we use X in place of the red reflectance, Y in place of the green reflectance, and Z in place of the blue reflectance. So cyan is actually calculated from CIE-X, magenta from CIE-Y, and yellow from CIE-Z. Now, it's not an ideal solution. There has been proposal made for a crude compromise to try to get this data closer to density, but it looks like there will be a 3x3 matrix that will do an even better job. So at the moment, though, do be aware, and this is covered thoroughly in the user guide, that if you want to generate these reference data, you must do them in XYZ. So you're going to extract the XYZ data from the tone ramps of your printing process and then save it as a text file. And how exactly can you do that? Well, once again, to make this as easy as possible, the file format we're loading here is an actual file you can create yourself. It's a simple text file. Let me actually open that, and here it is. It's a very, very simple file format. Here we've simply got a whole bunch of values. Here I believe I have one for every 1%. It's CMYK, and these are simply the tone values, not the TVI value. It's very important. It's the tone value. So the last value is always going to be 100, 100, 100, 100 for CMYK, and it's derived from CIE XYZ. Full instructions on how to do that are in the user guide for Curve 3.
2 points, there is a folder that's in the same place as the app.
Good.
It's called TVI Curve Files, and you can put your files in there, and they will appear at the bottom of one of the lists. And if you have more questions about the TVI calculation method, it's the same method that Bruce Lindblom documents on his website as well. And it's the same method that ColorThink has used for a long time to calculate curves out of profiles.
Cool.
As well. It's not like we just came up with this on the fly.
No, it's the recommended way of doing it if you don't use density. Yeah. Now, when you load that, it populates all of these 4 curves. If for some reason you said, look, I want to use the Greco or the Fogger curves for CMY, but I'd like to use ISO F for black, you can still do that. But if you go back to load custom again, then once again, it's going to override it. Now, here is a different curve set, just to show that we can do anything we like. This is just a joke. I did this for a demo this week. Any text file that you export from the Create Curves window, when you go CGATS export, that is the file format that we're looking for in the TVI window. So it's pretty straightforward, very easy to create these reference files if you want to do it. So the other big feature of this software is that initially we were only calibrating for G7. With Curve3, we added the TVI calibration because we recognize that a lot of our European clients want to do G7 and TVI. So we've put that in for them, and now we've enhanced that. But by special request from a number of people, we've now added a third completely different function to Curve3. So it's now becoming a bit of a Swiss Army knife of calibration opportunities. So special inks. If you look at the little icons here, for G7 calibration, our color icons here are CMYK. If you click on the TVI button, the color icons are CMYK. If we click on special inks, we've picked 4 arbitrary non-CMYK colors to show you that you can actually do special ink calibration with literally any colored inks you like on Earth. And you can still print the same old P2P target, and we can calibrate up to 4 special inks, that's non-CMYK inks, at a time. We don't at the moment have any plans to do 6 or 8 curves at a time. That would be a major rewrite of the software. If you're running a press run with CMYK plus, let's say, 3 additional inks, put 2 P2P targets up there, measure them separately, calculate the curves separately. It's not a big deal. Now, what is the algorithm? We express it here. It's really just a % of standard delta E 76. And this algorithm was given to us by Mark Samworth of ESCO, and I believe he says he got it from somewhere else as well. It's a very interesting algorithm. We've done a lot of testing on this. There's no other algorithm we know of that is so appropriate for calibrating virtually any ink. It actually works with the same CMYK inks as well. What we do is we look at the whole ramp of the ink. We calculate the delta E of each patch relative to paper. So whatever the color of any patch of any ink on paper, it's going to be a little bit different than the color of paper, we hope. What is that difference? We can calculate it in delta E. And in most cases, on a ramp of ink from 0 to 100, no matter what the color of the ink, the 100% patch is going to have the highest delta E. So having calculated all the delta E's, it's a simple matter in the software to express them as a fraction or a percentage of the total delta E. We then, in Curve, simply linearize the data so we get a straight line. So this is very similar to the TVI process, but a little different. We find that we don't need to build in a 16% TVI. It turns out that a linear function of delta E throughout your scale produces a very, very nice looking calibration. So I'm in the special ink mode. I'm going to go in here and I'm just going to load some special data. That would be special inks. I'm just going to load this one here and see what happens. Okay, from the surface it doesn't look very different. When I go into Create Curves, though, you can see now, if we look at Analyze Color, these are strange inks. And they're color-coded according to the channels we thought were. At the moment, the yellow ink was now being occupied by what appears to be a sort of a magenta-y ink. The cyan ink was occupied by a much more saturated cyan, etc. And the magenta ink was a very weak beige color. You see this magenta ink? There was almost a cream ink. There was almost nothing to it. So at the moment, the color of these diagrams doesn't really show you the color of the ink. We might get that in a future version if we're lucky. see the LAB values of those inks, and the Create Curves is doing something very sane and normal. If we look at those deltas, this is a fairly extreme case. We're asking for up to a minus 10% on the magenta, about a plus 7 on what is not really magenta, it's the yellow channel. But these curves are working very, very well. What you're getting is now a universal way of calibrating any ink at all, and it has an advantage over one of the other popular methods. There's a tendency to look at the maximum absorption in wavelengths and just use that as the method of calibrating. The trouble is, the same ink on two different press runs, it may actually peak at a different wavelength. We find this method to be a lot more robust. So for what it's worth, please use it. Let us know if it works for you if you're using special inks. I want to emphasize, though, that the special inks are not part of the G7 algorithm. It's a completely new function. So the last thing I want to show you real briefly is the user guide.
Just to let people know, because they often ask, the user guide is distributed with the app. And on Windows 7 and earlier, at least, we create a link in the Start menu so that you can open the PDF from there. On the Mac side, you just go into the app folder, or on the Windows side, and grab the PDF. So if you've downloaded Curve3, you already have it. It's in the same folder.
Yeah, and we know that there's going to be updates from time to time to the software, and maybe we'll have some typos or additions to the user guide. So the user guide is now actually online. It's online, and you can get there from the PDF. So if you go to hutchcolor.com/curve, G, no space, .htm, you'll get whatever is the latest version. There is no version up there yet. What came with the software is still the same software. A couple of changes we've done. It's now bookmarked. So if you want to go to each section, you can do that. And if you go to the contents page is actually linked now. So making it a little bit easier to navigate the user guide. Lots and lots of information here about things, including the custom TVI curves. All of the information about how to create your own TVI graph is in there.
One thing I don't know if you covered is VPR.
Big change in VPR. If you are currently a VPR user, you will know that if you load spectral data and you VPR it, it's going to come out as LAB data. Now we've added the curve spectral values. This is huge. This is going to be enormous for people who are printing a characterization data and they'd like to put the curves on it, save the cost of the second press run, but retain the spectral data. We believe this is the first software in the world that will allow you to do that, and it's huge. So typically you would load whatever calibration curve is there, you'd open whatever IT8 data you wanted to load, and when you curve it, you will actually get the curved spectral values if you started with spectral values. So this is pretty exciting. But one more point I want to tell you about VPR, something we didn't really realize when we released Curve2. If you have VPR and you have done 2 press runs, let's say, and the second press run is really, really nice but not quite perfect, if you apply the curves of the second press run to the measured data from the second press run, although you're not saving that press run, what you will do is actually finally optimize that data. So now the data that comes out of the VPR function will be with perfect G7, even though your second press run wasn't quite perfect. So whether or not you use VPR to save a press run, it's also useful for fine-tuning your press run so that you get literally perfect G7, gray balance, and NPDC. And that's a very, very nice feature. But there's yet another feature. Imagine you have data that is very, very noisy, and I'm going to show you what I mean by that in Photoshop. Here is an IT8 target that was created, or it's rather a profile, made from data of a flexo press run that was extremely noisy. And I don't know if you can see it, but if you look at these patches up here, there's some reversals going on. There's some very nasty results up here. Someone is not muted. So here we have a really bad noisy data. What I was able to do in Curve3 is go and make any run at all. And this run you can load literally any data you like. It doesn't matter. I'm going to load that horrible text file. You remember the one? I go to Create Curves. I pick 50%, and then I delete the 50% point. If you have VPR and you do this, what you've created now is actually what we call a null calibration. So I'm actually naming it null calibration. Now I'm going to go into VPR, and I'm going to load the null calibration curves. If I now open that measured data, the IT8 data that was noisy, I'm not going to actually do it here, and I do curve and export, it's not going to apply a curve to it, but it is going to apply a beautiful little side effect of VPR. It's going to smooth this data out. So instead of seeing these ugly blotches, you'll now see something that's a lot prettier. And I'm going to say edit, assign profile. Right now what is assigned is the actual data, the noisy data, and now I'll do the one that is noisy VPR smoothed. I've named this profile with what I did. And if you look now, you'll see that all that blockiness has disappeared. Same data. We didn't calculate curves. We simply ran it through VPR to smooth the data. This is huge. I am now doing this all the time. Even if I've got a perfect data set, I will actually run it through a null VPR, and it smooths it, and I'm getting dramatically smoother results in cases where we had great difficulty printing evenly and getting a really nice-looking IT8 target. And by the way, you can do that on data that you measured 20 years ago. It doesn't have to be an IT8 data or IT8 target that was printed through Curve. It could be data that already exists. So I hope you'll find that useful. That is probably the first feature that I've discovered that makes me want to encourage people to buy the VPR upgrade, even if they wouldn't have normally used it for its primary purpose.
If people have questions, we do have one question in, and that is, where can we find the Special Inks P2P?
Well, there isn't at the moment a Special Inks P2P target. It's the same P2P target. You would literally simply replace the yellow, magenta, and cyan inks with whatever inks you like. The slight awkwardness is you have to remember which channel is which. It's still going to be labeled CMYK in Curve3. If I go to the Special Ink mode and then go to calibrate, it's still calling it cyan, magenta, yellow, black. You have to remember that it's not really that. It's the inks you wanted. So we'd love to change that as well. Maybe that will be changed. But at the moment, it's the same P2P. The smoothing average all the data sets you input are only the one you select. All of them. In fact, it does it in a very cool way. If we load a whole bunch of P2P target data in here, the more we load in, the more powerfully smooth works. It actually takes all of the data, adds it into one huge file, and then uses that to calculate the model by which it smooths that data. Any other questions here?
Hello? Under the setup tab,
Yep.
I'm in an inkjet digital printing environment. Under method, I use the G7, of course. And when would I select the measured little checkbox?
Oh, that's a good question. Only if your RIP requires measured data. A few RIPs will not allow you to put wanted data in. They require measured data. So that's something that's covered very thoroughly in the user guide. Unless your RIP has that kind of problem, you would never click that button.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so you really don't need to worry about that. The fact that you're on inkjet means you probably never have to worry about it.
Oh, okay, great. Thanks.
You're welcome.
I had a question concerning the density normalization.
Yep.
Don, you had said that you wouldn't use this for offset. Is there any point, if you're running, say, an ultra-strong series of inks, and so your normal densities might be 210 on black, 170 or so on cyan, and such, would you use it for something like that?
No, that's not really what... I can only just hear you, but I think I did hear what you said. You're asking, would this normal densities be useful to change the solid density? Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, if for somebody who's running high-end work with a special set of inks that are, say, 20% stronger than the norm, and so they're running densities that are that much higher as well.
Probably not. Quite honestly, I've only seen this. Here's the problem. We're illustrating the problem here. I think you can see it quite clearly. If you have measurements that plug heavily like this, you see this curve, the NPDC curve, that's an indication that if you run these curves, these compensation curves, you're going to get ugly-looking TVI results. That would be about the only occasion you'd want to click on the normalized high densities. I don't think I've ever seen curves quite as bad as this in offset. But if you do see a curve like this, if you find that your CMY By the way, I think this only does work on CMY. I don't think it works on the black. But if you do see this in your CMY results, off and offset press, you might want to try doing that. But my experience is this really is only a problem on inkjet.
Okay.
Okay?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, this is Sonny. I have a question.
Hey, Sonny.
Are you guys planning to do a curve export to Printergy Harmony?
We would love to. If someone can give us the file format and the protocol, we will do it at no charge to Printergy or Harmony or the user. It is our desire to put as many direct connections in there as we can. At the moment, we have for Apogee, Konica Minolta, XML, and TED. TED is it's becoming an international standard for exporting data sets. But, Sonny, if you can help us find out what that format is, and as long as it's something that we technically can do, I think we'd love to do it, wouldn't we, Steve?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, I'll do it.
And for you, Sonny, we'll do it for a real deal.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We had another request during this presentation for that format, so that's great. We'll definitely be on that.
Basically, the problem Steve and I have is that we have real jobs as well as doing this. And we don't have a lot of bandwidth resources to go out and knock on every RIP door. The exciting thing is more and more RIPs, including one very big name RIP that I cannot name, are suddenly realizing or starting to realize, oh my gosh, we better support G7. And they are either going off and building their own G calibration method, which is fine, or they're saying, you know what, Curve's already out there, let's just plug in. So we're finding more and more friendliness, if you like, between the RIP manufacturers. So hopefully, over the course of the next year, we're going to be able to come out with new dot releases that will have more RIP names in there. There's one very exciting thing that I can't talk about. It's going to affect an awful lot of users. We're going to be able to directly output to one of the better-known RIPs in the relative near future, and we're excited about that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Under that pull-down you're just showing, I noticed that there's a Photoshop curve. When would you use that?
I believe it or not, I have a client in New York City. She makes maybe 3 proofs a week, and she uses this. She doesn't have a RIP. So she uses this to do G7 calibration in Photoshop. It was originally put in there for R&D purposes. There's an even more exciting thing, the one underneath it, device link profile. Seeing as you ask it about the Photoshop curve, let me tell you that I never use the Photoshop curve anymore. I use the DLP because that's more exciting. What the DLP allows us to do is actually send all of these values out here with 100% precision as a dummy DLP or as a limited DLP. It's a device link profile that wasn't linking to devices, but we used that wrapper to enclose extremely high-resolution curves, 4 curves, CMYK, and in Photoshop CS4, CS5, and CS6, you can actually apply that device link profile, and it will be exactly the same as if you'd used curves, but with vastly more precision. As you probably know, you can only have 14 points on a Photoshop curve, and they are Bezier smoothed whether you like it or not, and you can't have them very close together. Any closer than about 2%, and it doesn't let you do it. So if you're interested in the Photoshop curve thing, you'd probably rather use the DLP. Now, there is one particular use that I do have for Photoshop curves. You can export a Photoshop curve. Let's say you go to the trouble to make a P2P where you assign to it FOGRA 39 data, and then you calculate the corrections. They're not very strong corrections, but you can now export that as a Photoshop curve. You could now open a FOGRA 39 file from Europe, apply that curve in Photoshop real quickly, and it would now be optimized for printing on a Grackle calibrated press. And you could do the vice versa of that as well. In fact, I have those curves, and I think I might decide to put them on my website. I'm going to actually go to the link on my website where you can download the latest version. This is now essentially a Curve3 user guide page, and I'm planning on putting some additional stuff up here, and what I might put in here are some pre-built Photoshop curves for people who want to convert FOGRA data to Grackle and Grackle data to FOGRA. If anyone thinks that would be useful, send me an email and I'll do that.
I'm Matt with American Greetings.
Hey, Matt.
Real quick, I'm running inkjets, and I'm using Curve2, and I have a VPR. and I've been trying to streamline my process by using the VPR. And when I load in my IT8 and then my P2P, generate my VPR, I'm trying to bring that back into iProfiler. But iProfiler will not recognize the text data.
Yes.
Bad?
If you're not afraid of Excel, give me a side email, and I'll solve that problem for you.
Okay.
It's specific to the values in the header that I1 Profiler wants. Curve3 now does export in the format that I1 Profiler is happy with.
Okay, because I've been taking it into Profile Maker and then just saving it out again, and then it seems to import it, but I didn't know if that was the best way of doing it.
It probably is okay.
Okay, thank you.
So we are exporting with the header data intact?
Yeah, we are. Pat here did a bunch of tests to figure out.
Lovely, yeah. I had built a workbook, a clumsy workbook that would copy whatever header you wanted. It's a real hookup. That's good news.
Cool. Now, one thing I did want to mention, Don, if you could pull down the Curve3 menu there, select Feedback.
Yep.
I just wanted to let everybody know that this is in the software. Lots of people do use it, but we want to encourage you to use it. And especially for things like requesting specific RIP formats, this is a great way of making sure it gets on our to-do list. It doesn't mean it's going to take place quickly, but it's on our to-do list as opposed to an email, which is great for conversation, but can fall off, unfortunately. Also, in the last field at the bottom there, it says Submit Files. You can drag files right in there. You don't even need to click Load File. And so if you have example RIP documents that your RIP takes, drag it in there, set it up as a request in the feedback system, and then we will definitely know it, we'll have it, and we'll have the file that we need on hand for when we get around to implementing that. So we do encourage you to use it, and we thank all of you who do use it. And Don apparently needs beer.
File in here. So if you have problem files, it can be screenshots, it can be pretty much anything. You click Submit. I have my request for beer to CHROMiX, and I expect a fairly prompt response. Good.
This is Bill Whitfield. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
I have one more question. I'm a flexo printer, and of course, in digital plates, we have to deal with a big bump at the 1%.
Yep.
I was curious, if I use my own CGATS file and only put 2 points, so 1% and 100%, and make the 1 be a 7, and then run my test, can I then go back when I actually put in the measured data and put a whole bunch of more points in there, and it'll calculate those in-between points for me? Or does it need to have the value from each point that I'm going to need a new value for? For instance, 1, 10, 25, 50, or what? Do it automatically.
Are you talking about a file in place of the P2P, or a file to be loaded as the based on?
Yeah, the based on.
You can pretty much load anything you like. So in other words, you would like to have a file. Let me just see if I can do this real quickly.
We'd only have 2 points. We'd have a 1% and a 100%.
Yeah, I think that will work, actually.
And then when I go to calculate the actual curves, I'll put points into the curve window and put in my 19s, my 25s, whatever. And then will it fix up the rest for me, or do I have to have all those in the original file?
I think it's going to work. But the best way to find out is actually to try it. I'm trying it right now. So in other words, you have a 1 that goes to, what, a 7?
Let's put 7 in there just for the heck of it.
Yeah. Let's see. Easiest way to find out. So I'm going to save this. 1, 2, 7. The text file. I'm going to go back to Curve3. We are going to say linear, no, load initial curve. And where would that be? It'll be in my non-linear, 1, 7. Let's see what the hell happens. Yes, it looks like it did it. Yep, it looks like you can do that.
Okay, so then I got set my front window. So then it would have to calculate the rest all the way up, and I could put new points in there and everything. Cool. Makes my job much easier because I've been doing this with Turnigy with a lot of little math notes.
I don't guarantee this is going to work. We were obviously allowed to load that file, and I believe Curve is going to truthfully now interpret the fact that it now knows that your 1% was a 7. Yeah.
Well, I can check it against doing it manually and make sure
let
it
us
works.
know if it works. It should.
Yeah.
Work. It looks like it should. Yeah. Great question.
Great.
I love the questions like that.
Don, this is Andrew from American Greetings. Similar to the previous question, if we were using digital presses simulating offset, So you would have simulation on top of the actual press calibration. That would be the equivalent of your initial curve, right?
If you're talking about the Indigo especially, is that what you're talking about?
Right.
Indigo has one specific oddity that no other printer has. The default curve in Indigo has 0 dot gain, so it comes out very, very light. So we have a special P2P target called the P2P26. Are you aware of that?
Yes, I heard it.
Okay, if you use the P2P26, it actually, let me see if it's up, but I'm probably going to put it on, I think I'll put it on the user guide page because it would make sense, wouldn't it? The P2P26 actually has a built-in curve in the target itself. So when you print that through that default curve of Indigo, it darkens the target to roughly where it should be when it's finally printed. It adds 16%. Now that means that the target prints much better representation of what's going to happen when the device has been darkened, and so the gray balance is calculated more accurately. So I'm not sure if that's what you were looking for, but that would avoid you the need to put a preemptive curve in the RIP and then do a based on here. Now, if you want to put a preemptive curve in there, absolutely you can. I recommend you basically put about a 16% dot gain curve in there, and then you could use the P2P25. So it would be two ways of skinning the same cat.
I will try to use that file, but also on different RIP, on Zycon RIP, what we discovered was that if we were running just the default linear curve, we were getting negative values, especially in the highlights. So the TVI curves were pretty insane. So we had to push the TVI simulating 50% dot gain, and from that we were making adjustments.
You were getting negative printed values?
Yeah.
So it was actually dropping out completely?
Right.
On the Indigo?
No, on the Zycon.
Oh, okay. That's interesting, yeah. So I haven't seen that one deliberately myself. Yeah, but once again, as long as you put in that text file, what you did on the RIP, Curve can now calculate and compensate correctly for it.
Right. This will help, especially that on the Zycon, when you are modifying your aim points, each modification affects existing values. This way we will be able to arrive at the wanted values rather than the measured values using delta. So this should help.
That's great. That is going to be useful too.
Probably time to wrap this up.
Very gratifying to have so many good questions.
Yes, great questions. Thank you all. Thank you all for participating. I'm reachable at upton@chromix.com. You can also reach Rick Hatmaker for sales information at sales@chromix.com. And Don, I'm going to give out your email address, is don@hutchcolor.com. And we will continue to work our way on this. As we mentioned, by all means, put in feedback information if you have questions or new features you want, and contact us if you need anything else. There's one thing we completely forgot to mention again, and that's one-run targets, which is the ability to combine targets together into one target, and Curve will automatically split them apart into an IT8 and a P2P kind of thing. Sorry we didn't have time for that. If you do have questions about that, by all means get in touch with us. We have the targets, and we can explain the process to you. So thank you very much for your time. Hope everybody has a great weekend.
Thanks very much,
Bye-bye.
everybody.